In 1856, America was a nation nearing a breaking point. Although the carnage of the Civil War was still several years away, the deep rift between North and South had already begun to manifest itself in acts of violence throughout the country. One episode in particular illustrated the mood of the nation more than any other. The violent beating of Senator Charles Sumner on the floor of the United States Senate. It drew both jeers and applause from a nation at a crossroads. It became known as the caning, and it's the topic of tonight's Real History.
Charles Sumner was the United States Senator from Massachusetts and was the country's strongest, most unwavering anti-slavery voice. There's a great deal going on in the country, most of it revolving around the slavery debate. The political center of that debate is Kansas. Kansas is about to apply for statehood, and at this point there's a huge battle in Kansas between pro-slavery and anti-slavery voices as to whether Kansas will be admitted as a free state or a slave state. There was violence and battles between pro and anti-slavery forces. The violence includes murder, assaults, property damage. Lawrence, Kansas is sacked by pro-slavery Southerners. The North, and Sumner is one of these folks, referred to Kansas as Bleeding Kansas. Charles Sumner loved the big stage. Even though he's a great writer, he viewed the spoken word as really his best weapon. On May 19th of 1856, Sumner prepares to give the speech of his life, which he calls the crime against Kansas. There's enormous anticipation for the speech. The galleries are packed. Even the women's gallery was filled to overflowing. Charles Sumner delivers the 5-hour speech, and it focuses really in two major areas. He really castigates the South for its stand on slavery and for rushing into Kansas in an attempt to influence the elections there. That's kind of the intellectual part of the speech. The emotional part of the speech that really becomes important in this whole episode is that Charles Sumner personally insults the senator from South Carolina, Andrew Butler. South Carolina is the strongest pro-slavery state in the Union at that time. Sumner personally insults Andrew Butler in some really provocative ways. And he says that Andrew Butler has a mistress who is ugly and polluted in the eyes of most of the world, but lovely in his eyes. That is the harlot slavery. He compares slavery to a prostitute, which was a huge, huge insult to the people of the South and to Butler specifically. There's real outrage on the Senate floor. Many Northerners felt Sumner went too far. Some had warned him not to include the personal insults in his speech. He ignored them. The South, of course, was completely outraged. They viewed Sumner's remarks, quite frankly, as fighting words. One of the people in the chamber was South Carolina Congressman Preston Brooks. Brooks was a pro-slavery supporter. He was the second cousin of Senator Andrew Butler. After he hears Charles Sumner's speech, Preston Brooks, of course, is outraged, and he's trying to figure out what should he do to avenge his relative, to avenge his state. And so finally, Preston Brooks settles on a very, very different form of retaliation. Just after noontime on May 22nd, 1856, Preston Brooks walks into the Senate chamber, and he strides up the center aisle, carrying a cane in his hand. Sumner is at his desk with his head down, his legs trapped under his desk that's bolted to the floor. Brooks reaches him and, as he gets to Sumner's desk, says, "Mr. Sumner, I have read your speech over twice. It is a libel against my relative and my state." And with that, raises his cane and strikes Sumner on the top of his head. Sumner is blinded almost immediately by blood, and Brooks at that point simply loses it and begins to beat Sumner again and again. Sumner falls and stumbles and gasps, "Oh God, oh Lord," falls into another desk. Brooks continues to hit him again and again until finally his cane has splintered into many pieces and Sumner lapses into unconsciousness. As the caning is going on, very, very few people step up to actively save Charles Sumner. Sumner is not well liked, even by Northern colleagues. He's got a certain arrogance, a certain condescension. Charles Sumner's Northern colleagues take him into a side room after the attack. Sumner suffers enormous injuries. He has spinal injuries, some kind of brain trauma. He misses the next 3 years in the Senate as a result of his injuries. Preston Brooks is a hero in the South. There are many, many rallies and celebrations. He receives hundreds of canes as a gift, many of them inscribed with the words, "Hit him again." I would call the caning one of the most provocative events in American history. It is the no turning back point on the road to civil war. The most immediate result of the caning was that thousands of moderate and conservative Northerners, people who were not necessarily abolitionists, joined the abolitionist Republican Party, this brand new party to which Charles Sumner was a member, and make a huge difference in the growth of the Republican Party. So it's almost as though the caning redefines these attitudes north and south. And so there is very, very little room for moderation and very, very little room for compromise after this event. So what the caning does is it obliterates that very, very fragile truce between North and South that had existed really since the country's founding. The question becomes, would the Civil War have happened without the caning?